Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. In a small village surrounded by a dense forest, where the smell of freshly baked bread hung in the air every morning, lived a 12-year-old girl known to everyone as Little Red Riding Hood. Her real name was Sophia, but ever since her grandmother had given her a beautiful handmade red cape, no one called her any different. The cape, sewn with love and dedication, had a hood so perfect that it seemed to have been tailor-made for her, and the little girl was rarely seen without her favorite garment. Helena Little Riding Hood's mother was a hard-working woman who had been running the village's only bakery on her own since she was widowed. Every morning before the sun had even risen, she was already rolling up her sleeves, preparing dough and baking the bread that fed the locals. The aroma emanating from her bakery was like a natural alarm clock for the whole village, and people said that just smelling it was enough to make the day start better. On that particular morning, which would later prove to be decisive in Little Riding Hood's life, the sky dawned with a different hue, more gray than usual, as if nature itself wanted to give her a warning. Helena was more worried than usual, as she had received news that her mother, Little Riding Hood's grandmother, was ill. The old lady lived alone on the other side of the forest, in a cozy little house, about an hour's walk from the village. "Sophia, my dear," Helena called out, using her daughter's real name to demonstrate the seriousness of the moment. "Your grandmother isn't feeling well, and I need you to take this basket to her." The woman was carefully arranging in a wicker basket the freshest bread. She had just baked a jar of the purest honey she could find, and some medicinal herbs she used to grow in her small garden. Little Riding Hood, who was helping to organize the shelves in the bakery, approached with interest. Her green eyes, inherited from her father, sparkled with the expectation of an adventure, even if it was just a simple delivery. The girl loved visiting her grandmother, and the stories she told about ancient times always fascinated her. "But you have to promise me something," Helena continued, holding her daughter's hands tightly. "Under no circumstances must you deviate from the main path. The forest can be dangerous, especially for a little girl on her own." Her eyes conveyed genuine concern, a reflection of the rumors circulating around the village about strange creatures that had been spotted among the trees in recent weeks. The girl nodded solemnly, although in her young heart there was no room for such fear. After all, she knew that path like the back of her hand, having walked it countless times with her mother. "I promise, Mama, I'll go straight to Grandma's and be back before nightfall." However, there was something different in the air that morning. As Little Riding Hood prepared to leave, adjusting her red cloak and checking the contents of her basket one last time, a pair of yellow eyes watched her from afar, hidden among the bushes that marked the beginning of the forest. It was Magnus, a wolf unlike any other that had ever inhabited these lands. His fur was as black as the darkest night, and his intelligence far surpassed that of his fellows. Magnus was no ordinary predator. He had learned to observe humans over the years, studying their habits and developing a unique ability to understand their language. His hunger was not just for meat, but for power and control. For months he had been planning something great, something that would forever change the balance between the forest dwellers and the villagers. When Little Riding Hood finally left her red cape, standing out against the green of the vegetation, Magnus felt that his opportunity had arrived. The girl represented everything he despised: inhuman naivety, trust, innocence, and a sense of security that he considered foolish and unfounded. The path through the forest meandered between centuries-old trees, some so old that their tops intertwined at the top, creating a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the leaf-covered ground. Little Riding Hood walked merrily along, occasionally pausing to admire a colorful flower or listen to the song of a particularly melodious bird. It was during one of these pauses that Magnus decided to make his approach. With silent, calculated steps, he emerged from behind a large tree, presenting himself not as the predator he was, but as a gentle forest dweller. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and melodious, completely different from the growl his species normally produced. "Good morning, little lady," he greeted, keeping a respectful distance. "What a beautiful red cape you have." His yellow eyes shone with a disturbing intelligence, but Little Riding Hood, in her innocence, saw only friendly curiosity in that gaze. The little girl, surprised, but not frightened, responded to the greeting with the courtesy her mother had taught her. At that crucial moment, her mother's warnings seemed distant and hazy, as if they belonged to another world, a world where wolves didn't talk and flowers didn't dance in the breeze. What Little Riding Hood didn't realize was that this apparently chance encounter marked the beginning of a series of events that would test not only her courage and cunning, but also her ability to distinguish between appearances and reality. The forest, which had always been his safe playground, was about to reveal its darkest secrets, and the journey that had begun as a simple delivery would turn into an adventure that would forever change his understanding of trust, obedience, and the consequences of our choices. Magnus watched Little Riding Hood's every move carefully, noticing how she held the basket tightly against her chest. The aroma of fresh bread and honey reached his sensitive nostrils, but that wasn't what really interested him. There was something deeper to his plan, something that went beyond simply satisfying his hunger. "Where are you going in such a hurry, little one?" he asked, his velvety voice masking his true intentions. The wolf circled the girl at a calculated distance, his movements flowing like dark water. Little Riding Hood, still enchanted by the idea of a talking wolf, replied without hesitation, "I'm going to visit my grandmother who is ill. I'll bring fresh bread and honey so she can recover." Her words were full of pride in the mission her mother had entrusted her with. The wolf feigned genuine interest, his yellow eyes shining with false compassion. "What a devoted granddaughter you are! And where does your dear grandmother live?" As he spoke, Magnus was already mentally plotting the shortest route to the old woman's house, in a little house beyond the forest next to the big oak tree. Little Riding Hood replied, completely forgetting her mother's warnings about talking to strangers. "It's the only house with red flowers in the window." Magnus suppressed a triumphant smile. "You know, little one," he said, his voice as melodious as a lullaby. "I noticed some beautiful flowers, A little further on, I'm sure your grandmother would love a bouquet to brighten up her day of convalescence. The suggestion hit Little Riding Hood like a ray of sunshine through the clouds. Really? How come I didn't think of that before? She exclaimed, her green eyes shining with renewed enthusiasm. The most beautiful ones are in that direction, said Magnus, pointing with his snout to a small clearing to the left of the main path. They're rare flowers, which only bloom on special days, like today. As Little Riding Hood was tempted to pick the flowers, a small voice in her mind tried to remind her of the promise she had made to her mother. But the idea of making her grandmother smile with a colorful bouquet seemed too strong to resist. Maybe I can pick just a few, she muttered to herself, already turning off the main path. Magnus watched with satisfaction as the girl walked away, knowing that his plan was working perfectly. As soon as Little Riding Hood disappeared between the trees, the wolf quickly set off along the shortcut he knew so well. His paws barely touched the ground as he ran, moving with an agility that only years of experience in the forest could provide. Meanwhile, in the clearing, Little Riding Hood was discovering a veritable treasure trove of wildflowers. There were snow-white daisies, deep purple violets, and small yellow flowers that she had never seen before. Time seemed to flow differently in that place, as if nature itself was conspiring to make her forget her obligations. The girl didn't notice, but as she picked the flowers, small forest dwellers watched her with concern. One red squirrel in particular, called Redhead by the other animals, was well aware of Magnus's antics and tried, without success, to warn the girl of the danger. In the village, Helena began to feel an inexplicable restlessness. As she continued her work in the bakery, her thoughts constantly turned to her daughter. The clouds in the sky had darkened, and a cold wind was beginning to blow between the houses. At his grandmother's house, Magnus was already approaching with silent footsteps. The smoke coming from the chimney indicated that the lady was at home, probably preparing her afternoon tea as was her custom. The wolf adjusted his expression, rehearsing the sweetest voice he could produce. Riding Hood's grandmother, a white-haired lady with a kind face, was sitting in her rocking chair by the window, knitting yet another garment for her beloved granddaughter. The sound of soft knocks on the door surprised her, but didn't alarm her. After all, who could want to harm an old lady? Who is it? She asked, her voice weak from her illness. It's me, Grandma, your granddaughter, Magnus replied, perfectly imitating the voice of Little Riding Hood. I've brought you some fresh bread and honey. The lady smiled, her heart warmed by her granddaughter's supposed visit. Without suspecting a thing, she got up to open the door, completely oblivious to the danger that awaited her on the other side. In the clearing, Little Riding Hood finally realized how much time had passed. The sun was no longer so high in the sky, and the shadows of the trees had become longer. With a jolt, she gathered up the flowers she had picked and set off again, hoping that her little distraction hadn't delayed her arrival too much. What she didn't know was that her decisions that day had triggered a series of events that would test not only her courage, but also her ability to right her own wrongs. The forest, which had always seemed so welcoming, was beginning to show its darkest face, and the road to her grandmother's house had never seemed so long and threatening. Red the squirrel followed the girl, jumping from branch to branch, determined not to lose sight of her. He knew that Magnus was no ordinary wolf, and that his intentions went far beyond a simple meal. There were old stories in the forest, stories about the true nature of this predator and the dark powers it possessed. The wind was blowing harder now, making Little Riding Hood's red cape dance around her like a warning flag. The dark clouds in the sky seemed to follow her path, as if the weather itself wanted to warn her of the danger that awaited her. As Little Riding Hood hurried back through the forest, events at her grandmother's house took a dark turn. Magnus, after gaining entry to the house, revealed his true nature. The old woman barely had time to scream before the wolf cornered her. However, instead of attacking her as an ordinary predator, would Magnus had other plans. "Don't worry, lady," he said, with a smile that showed his sharp teeth. "I don't intend to hurt you. Yet. I just need you to cooperate with me." With surprising agility, the wolf led Grandma to the large oak cupboard in the corner of the room and locked her in. "Stay still and wait. Your granddaughter is on her way, and I have a little surprise for her." The grandmother, although frightened, kept her dignity. "You don't know my granddaughter," she said through the closet door. "She's smarter than she looks." Magnus laughed, a guttural sound that echoed through the small house. "We'll see," he replied, as he began to rummage through the lady's room. He found one of her nightgowns and her traditional nightcap, putting them on with meticulous care. His plan depended on the smallest detail. Meanwhile, in the forest, Little Riding Hood was beginning to notice subtle changes in her surroundings. The wind whispered through the trees in a different way, and the shadows seemed to move in strange ways. Red the squirrel continued to follow her desperately, looking for a way to warn her of the danger. It was then that the girl came across Sarah, a young woodcutter who often worked in that part of the forest. Sarah was gathering up her work tools, preparing to return home because of the worsening weather. "Little Riding Hood, what are you doing alone in the woods at this hour?" asked Sarah, her brow furrowed with concern. She knew all about the dangers in these parts. "I'm going to visit my grandmother," replied the girl, showing her basket. "She's sick, and Mom asked me to bring some groceries." Sarah looked up at the darkening sky and at the slightly wilted flowers in Little Riding Hood's hand. "You've strayed from the main path, haven't you?" Her voice was not one of accusation, but of genuine concern. Little Riding Hood blushed, nodding slightly. "Just for a moment to pick these flowers. A very kind wolf showed me where to find them." Sarah's face paled. "A wolf? Did you talk to Magnus?" Seeing the girl's confused expression, the woodcutter continued, "There are stories about him, Little Riding Hood. Old scary stories. He's no ordinary wolf." Redhead, realizing that at last someone could help, began making frantic signs, jumping from branch to branch and crying loudly. Sarah, who had spent her life in the forest, immediately understood that something was wrong. "We need to hurry," she said, picking up her axe. "Your grandmother could be in danger." Meanwhile, at his grandmother's house, Magnus had finished his preparations. Lying on the bed in his lady's nightgown and bonnet, he waited patiently. His yellow eyes shone in the dimness of the room, fixed on the door. Occasionally, small sounds came from the closet, which he silenced with a low growl. Little Hats and Sarah moved quickly through the forest, with the woodcutter leading the way along an alternative path she knew well. Magnus has plagued this forest for longer than anyone can remember, Sarah explained as they walked. "He's not just a predator. They say he's made a pact with ancient dark forces in the forest. The girl felt her heart racing with every step. The guilt of having disobeyed her mother weighed heavily on her shoulders. But now, her concern was entirely focused on her grandmother. Red continued to accompany them, occasionally running ahead to check the path. The little squirrel knew that time was of the essence. He had witnessed other Magnus ploys in the past and knew well the terrible fate that awaited those who fell into his traps. But why would he do that? Asked Little Riding Hood, her voice trembling slightly. Why deceive a little girl and her grandmother? Sarah sighed heavily as they dodged a fallen log. Magnus believes that by controlling humans, he can control the forest. Every person he deceives, every life he destroys, increases his power over these lands. The clouds above them grew darker and darker, and distant thunder began to sound. The forest seemed to respond to the tension of the moment, with the branches of the trees moving more agitatedly and the birds silencing their songs. Finally, they spotted the smoke from the chimney of their grandmother's house. Between the trees, Sarah signaled for them to stop. We need to be careful, she whispered. Magnus is cunning and dangerous. We can't just barge in. We need a plan. At that moment, Red began to make more urgent signals, pointing to a small window on the side of the house. Through it, they could see movement inside the room, a large, dark shape lying on his grandmother's bed. He's in there, whispered Little Riding Hood, her face pale with worry. What about my grandmother? Sarah studied the situation with experienced eyes. Years of living in the forest had taught her to think quickly in the dangerous situations. First, we need to find out where your grandmother is. Then we need to get Magnus out of that house. The two looked at each other, knowing that what came next would require all their courage and cunning. The storm was approaching, and with it the decisive moment of their confrontation with the wolf of the forest. Sarah and Chapeau silently approached the house, while Redhead continued his vigilant watch on the nearby branches. The woodcutter, with years of experience in dealing with dangerous situations in the forest, began to draw up a plan. Did you notice that little sound coming from the closet? Whispered Sarah, her eyes attentive to every movement inside the house. I bet your grandmother is locked in there. Magnus has always been more interested in mind games than direct violence. Chapeau nodded, feeling a mixture of relief that her grandmother was alive and guilt for having caused the whole situation. How can we help her without Magnus noticing? Sarah thought for a moment, looking at the axe in her hands. We need a distraction, something that will force Magnus out of the house, if only for a few minutes. It was then that Red began to make more animated signs, jumping between branches and pointing to other forest animals that were beginning to gather nearby. There were squirrels, rabbits, and even a few birds, all apparently responding to some kind of silent call from the little red squirrel. That's it, exclaimed Sarah in an excited whisper. The forest animals can help us. Magnus may be powerful, but even he has limits. Quickly, Sarah and Little Riding Hood began to organize their plan with the help of the forest animals. The rabbits would start by digging strategic holes around the house while the birds would create a noisy distraction. The squirrels, led by Redhead, would be responsible for a series of small provocations aimed at the wolf. When Magnus leaves to investigate the commotion, Sarah explained, I'll go in through the back door to free your grandmother. You, Little Riding Hood, will stay here with Redhead, ready to run if anything goes wrong. The little girl immediately protested, "But I want to help. It's my fault this happened." Sarah put a gentle hand on Little Riding Hood's shoulder. "You're already helping. Besides, if anything goes wrong, we'll need someone to run to the village and get more help." As the animals got into position, the sky continued to darken and the first raindrops began to fall. The timing would have to be perfect. Sarah knew that Magnus was too clever to fall for an obvious trick, but she also knew that even the most intelligent of predators could be outwitted when faced with multiple threats simultaneously. Inside the house, Magnus was starting to get impatient. He could sense that something was different in the air, apart from the approaching storm. The small sounds coming from outside the house, scratching of small paws, flapping wings, branches moving unnaturally, were beginning to irritate him. His grandmother, still locked in the closet, was also noticing the change in atmosphere. Years of living in the forest had taught her to recognize when something extraordinary was about to happen. She remained silent, but her heart was full of hope. "Now," signaled Sarah, and the plan was put into action. First, the birds began a deafening chorus, very different from their usual songs. It was a shrill, disturbing sound that echoed throughout the clearing. Simultaneously, the rabbits began hopping and tapping their paws on the ground in a frenetic rhythm, creating a vibration that could be felt inside the house. Magnus got out of bed, his instincts warning him of the danger. As he approached the window to investigate, Red and his fellow squirrels began their attack, throwing small nuts and sticks against the glass. The wolf growled in frustration. He knew something was wrong, but his pride wouldn't allow him to ignore such an affront to his territory. After a moment's hesitation, he decided that he needed to show those insolent creatures who really ran the forest. As soon as Magnus opened the front door, the animals stepped up their performance. The birds dived towards him, forcing him to dodge constantly, while the rabbits jumped between his feet, confusing his movements. Sarah seized the opportunity and, moving like a shadow, slipped through to the back door. With skill acquired from years of working in the forest, she managed to open it without making a sound. Inside the house, she quickly located the cupboard and, using her axe with surgical precision, managed to break the lock. Chapeau's grandmother emerged pale but determined. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, supporting the old woman. Outside, the situation was becoming increasingly chaotic. Magnus, enraged by the animals' attack, was beginning to show his true nature. His eyes glowed with a supernatural fire, and his form seemed to grow and distort in the shadows of the approaching storm. Little Riding Hood watched everything from her hiding place, her heart beating fast as she saw Sarah and her grandmother emerge discreetly through the back door. The plan was working, but something about Magnus's behavior worried her. The wolf didn't just look furious. There was something else, something dangerous and ancient, awakening in his eyes. "Do you think you can fool me?" roared Magnus, his voice now very different from the seductive melody he had used before. "I am the lord of this forest. I am the very darkness among the trees." The storm finally burst upon them, bringing with it lightning that illuminated the scene ghostly. Sarah, her grandmother, and Little Riding Hood quickly gathered at the edge of the clearing, ready to flee. But they knew the night was far from over. Magnus turned towards them, his eyes meeting those of Little Riding Hood. At that moment, the girl understood that her adventure was about to reach its climax, and that the true consequences of her disobedience were only just beginning to unfold. Magnus's roar echoed across the clearing, mixing with the thunder of the storm. The rain was falling heavily, now turning the forest floor into slippery mud. Little Riding Hood Sarah and her grandmother stood together while the forest animals continued their coordinated distraction. "You don't understand the true power of this forest, child," said Magnus, his voice carrying a supernatural echo. "For centuries, I've watched humans invade this territory, building their villages, cutting down trees, claiming that this land belonged to them." Sarah positioned herself protectively in front of Little Riding Hood, and her grandmother, her axe firmly in her hands. "And you think terrorizing a little girl and an old lady is going to change that?" she challenged. A cruel smile formed on the wolf's muzzle. "Every soul I bend to my will strengthens my hold on this forest. Every heart I corrupt with fear feeds my power." It was then that Little Riding Hood stepped forward, surprising everyone. The rain soaked her red cloak, but her green eyes shone with a newfound determination. "You're wrong," she said, her voice clear and firm despite the storm. "The forest doesn't belong to anyone. Not to us. Not to you." Red and the other animals approached Little Riding Hood, forming a makeshift line of defense. The little red squirrel climbed onto the girl's shoulder as if to show his support. Magnus growled, his form growing even larger in the shadows of the storm. "Silly child, do you think a few animals can stop me?" "It's not just a few animals," Grandma intervened, her voice weak but determined. "It's the forest itself that's turned against you, Magnus. Your greed and cruelty go against everything these lands stand for." As if responding to the lady's words, a strong wind began to blow, making the trees groan and bend. Leaves and branches were torn off, dancing in the air like a magical whirlwind. Sarah realized what was happening before anyone else. "The forest is awakening," she whispered, lowering her axe. The old stories were true. Magnus also sensed the change in the air, and for the first time a flash of fear crossed his yellow eyes. The power he held so dear was beginning to slip from his grasp, like water between his fingers. "No," he roared, advancing towards Little Riding Hood. "I won't let a child destroy everything I've built." But before he could reach her, roots emerged from the soggy ground, entwining around her paws. The animals of the forest, now in even greater numbers, surrounded the wolf, each contributing in their own way to stop it. Little Riding Hood felt a strange energy flowing through her, as if the forest itself was using her as a channel. Her red cape fluttered in the wind, no longer just a piece of fabric, but a symbol of something greater. "The forest doesn't need a lord," she declared, her voice blending in with the sound of the storm. "It needs guardians who respect and protect it." Little Riding Hood's words seemed to awaken something ancient in the heart of the forest. The trees began to move their roots and branches, enveloping Magnus more and more. The wolf struggled and growled, but for the first time in centuries, he encountered a power greater than his own. "This isn't possible," he shouted as his body began to be absorbed by the very earth he had so longed to control. "I am darkness. I am terror. You're just part of the forest," Sarah replied, "just like the rest of us. And now it has decided that its time is up." With a final howl of fury, and despair, Magnus was completely enveloped by the roots and disappeared into the earth. The storm began to subside, and the first rays of sunlight penetrated through the clouds, illuminating the clearing with a golden light. Little Riding Hood ran to hug her grandmother, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I'm sorry for disobeying you, for putting everyone in danger." She smiled gently, stroking her granddaughter's hair. "Sometimes we need to make mistakes to learn the most important lessons. You showed great courage today, my dear." Sarah watched the scene with a smile as the forest animals began to disperse peacefully. Red stayed close by, as if to make sure that everything was really all right. "The forest chose you, Little Riding Hood," said the woodcutter, "not as a mistress or dominatrix, but as a guardian, someone who understands that respect and harmony are more powerful than fear and control." In the days that followed, the story of what happened in that clearing spread through the village. The forest seemed more alive and welcoming than ever, and the villagers learned to treat it with more respect. Little Riding Hood continued to visit her grandmother regularly, but now she was always accompanied by Redhead and other forest friends. Her red cape became not just a piece of clothing, but a symbol of protection and harmony between the villagers and the nature that surrounded them. The little girl never forgot the lesson she had learned that day, that true strength lies not in dominating or controlling, but in respecting and protecting what we love. And so, peace returned to the forest, not through the fear that Magnus had tried to spread, but through the love and understanding that Little Riding Hood had shown. And when people asked about the forest wolf, the elders just smiled and said that it had become part of the ancient trees, an eternal reminder that nature always finds its own balance. The kingdom of Aurora has always been known for its golden mornings and endless fields of wildflowers. On the highest towers of the castle, colorful flags danced in the wind, celebrating the birth a few days ago of the long-awaited Princess Aurora, first daughter of King Stefan and Queen Beatrice. After years of waiting and praying to the heavens, the kingdom finally had its heiress. The castle's great hall had been elaborately decorated for the little princess's presentation. Silk tapestries in the colors of the kingdom, blue and gold, hung from the stone walls, while hundreds of scented candles illuminated the room with their soft light. The servants were running around, adjusting the last details of the tables, full of delicacies, and making sure everything was perfect for the arrival of the 12 fairy godmothers. Queen Beatrice, still recovering from childbirth, smoothed her golden hair in front of the mirror while watching the crystal cradle where her daughter slept serenely. King Stefan, a gentleman with a neatly trimmed beard, approached silently and placed his hands on his wife's shoulders. "She's perfect, isn't she?" whispered Beatrice, with tears of happiness in her eyes. "As perfect as her mother," replied Stefan, gently kissing the queen's forehead. The 12 fairies began to arrive one by one, each one more dazzling than the last. Their wings sparkled like diamonds under the candlelight, and their dresses seemed to be woven from the moonlight itself. The first to arrive was Primavera, with her pink hair and a dress adorned with tiny flowers. Next came Melodia, whose steps were so light that she seemed to float over the marble floor. Each fairy brought with them a special gift for the princess, stored in small crystal jars that emitted a soft, mysterious glow, the guests began to take their places at the long tables in the hall, while musicians played their harps and flutes, creating a magical and solemn atmosphere. The blessing ceremony was about to begin when an unexpected icy wind blew out all the candles in the hall. The large oak doors opened with a bang, revealing a tall, dark figure. It was Maleficent, the 13th fairy, who had not been invited to the celebration. Her green eyes glowed with a frightening intensity, and her black dress seemed to be made of her own shadows. A deathly silence overtook the hall as she advanced towards the royal cradle, her staff tapping rhythmically against the floor. What a lovely party! Her voice echoed through the hall, laden with irony. I imagine my invitation got lost somewhere along the way. King Stefan stood up, trying to keep his composure. Maleficent, we didn't think you'd. That I what? She interrupted, her cruel smile revealing perfectly white teeth. That I'd like to take part, that I might also have something to offer your precious princess. Queen Beatrice instinctively placed herself between the fairy and her daughter's cradle, but Maleficent pushed her away with a simple hand gesture. The other fairies looked at each other tense, knowing that they couldn't directly interfere in the actions of one of their sisters. Since I'm here, continued Maleficent, leaning over the cradle, I'll also give Princess Aurora my present. Her staff began to glow with a greenish, sinister light. On the day of her 15th birthday, the princess will stick her finger in a spinning wheel and die. The hall erupted in screams of horror as Maleficent laughed, her laughter echoing off the castle walls. Little Aurora began to cry, as if she understood the gravity of the curse she had just received. It was then that Luce, the youngest of the good fairies, and the only one who hadn't yet offered her gift, came forward. Her silver hair reflected the moonlight coming through the tall windows, and her expression was one of determination. I can't completely undo Maleficent's curse, she declared, her voice clear and firm, but I can change it. When Aurora sticks her finger in, instead of death, she will fall into a deep sleep, and from this sleep, she will only awaken with the kiss of true love. Maleficent watched the intervention with a mocking smile on her lips. As you wish, she said, spinning on her heels. Fate is sealed. And with that, she disappeared in a cloud of green smoke, leaving behind only the echo of her cruel laughter. King Stefan, determined to protect his daughter, immediately ordered all the spinning wheels in the kingdom to be burned. Guards were sent to every village, every house, every barn, collecting and destroying any instrument that might pose a threat to the princess. The 11 remaining fairies gathered around the cradle, each offering their unique gifts: beauty, grace, music, wisdom, kindness, and other attributes that would make Aurora an extraordinary princess. But even with all these blessings, the shadow of Maleficent's curse hung over the castle like a dark cloud on a summer's day. Queen Beatrice, still trembling, held her daughter in her arms, silently promising that she would do everything in her power to protect her. King Stefan, for his part, immediately began planning ever stricter security measures, determined to prevent the prophecy from being fulfilled. And so, as the night wore on and the guests retired in silence, the fate of little Princess Aurora began to unfold, woven by the invisible threads of magic, love, and fear in a pattern that not even the fairies could fully predict. The years following the celebration of Aurora's birth were marked by drastic changes in the kingdom. King Stefan, consumed by concern for his daughter's safety, transformed the once cheerful castle into a fortress of rules and restrictions. Guards were stationed in every corridor, and visitors were thoroughly examined before entering the royal gates. Little Aurora grew up protected by these stone walls, but her gentle and curious nature could not be contained. At the age of 5, her golden hair, like her mother's, already reached her waist, and her blue eyes shone with a vivacity that charmed everyone who met her. The blessings of the fairies were clearly evident. Her voice was as melodious as a bird's song, her movements as graceful as a gentle dance, and her kindness touched the hearts of all the servants in the castle. Queen Beatrice tried to balance her husband's excessive protection with moments of normality for her daughter. Secretly, she allowed Aurora to play in the castle gardens, where butterflies danced among the flowers and birds made their nests. It was at these times that the princess seemed truly happy, running free and imagining stories about the fairies who had blessed her. The 12 good fairies, although they couldn't stay at the castle constantly due to their other magical obligations, visited Aurora regularly. Each visit was a special occasion, full of little spells and wonderful stories that fed the young princess's imagination. Spring made flowers sprout from the most unlikely corners, while Melody taught Aurora to sing to the birds that visited her window. As Aurora grew up, her curiosity about the world beyond the castle walls increased. At the age of 8, she began to ask more frequent questions about why she couldn't go out to see the village or play with other children. King Stefan always shrugged it off, making up stories about imaginary dangers lurking beyond the gates. But father, Aurora asked one afternoon, how can I be a good princess if I don't know our people? The king, touched by his daughter's precocious wisdom, simply hugged her tightly, unable to explain his deepest fears. Queen Beatrice, watching the scene, felt her heart breaking between the desire to protect her only daughter and the need to allow her to grow up free and happy. It was at this time that the dreams began. Aurora often woke up during the night talking about a woman in green who called her to dance on a high tower. The queen recognized in these accounts the subtle influence of Maleficent, who, even without physically appearing, seemed to find ways to reach the princess through her dreams. Worried, the queen secretly summoned Luce, the youngest of the good fairies, for consultation. The fairy, now more experienced, but still retaining her characteristic gentleness, explained that the dreams were a natural manifestation of the magic surrounding Aurora. We can't stop the magic from reaching her, explained Luce, her silver dress shimmering in the moonlight. But we can teach her to be strong enough to resist any negative influence. Following Luce's advice, the queen began to tell Aurora stories about courage, wisdom, and true love. The princess absorbed every word with fascination, especially the stories about how true love could overcome any obstacle. Meanwhile, in the darkest corners of the kingdom, Maleficent watched Aurora grow up through her pet raven. The evil fairy hadn't given up on her revenge, but she waited patiently, knowing that every day that passed brought the princess closer to her sealed destiny. The years went by, and Aurora blossomed into an extraordinary young woman. At the age of 12, she already displayed a wisdom beyond her years, mixed with a captivating innocence that was the product of her sheltered upbringing. Even confined to the castle she found ways to spread joy. She cultivated a small garden in her room, sang to cheer up the guards on their lonely shifts, and learned everything she could about governance from her tutors. King Stefan, although still vigilant, began to relax his restrictions, slightly allowing Aurora to take part in more activities within the castle. Small parties were organized occasionally, always with carefully selected guests, where the princess could dance and socialize under the watchful eye of her parents. But the older Aurora grew, the stronger the feeling in Queen Beatrice's heart became. She knew that they couldn't protect her daughter forever, and that fate would somehow find its way into her life. During the nights when everyone was asleep, the queen would climb to the highest tower in the castle and look up at the stars, praying that her daughter would not only find safety, but also the happiness she deserved. And so, as Aurora's 15th birthday drew ever closer, a quiet tension began to grow in the kingdom of Aurora. The inhabitants of the castle, from the humblest servant to the king himself, felt the weight of fate approaching like dark clouds, heralding an inevitable storm. But in the midst of all this apprehension, Aurora remained a ray of light, her laughter echoing through the castle corridors, like a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there is still hope. As Aurora approached her 14th year of life, the atmosphere in the castle became increasingly tense. King Stefan stepped up security, doubling the number of guards, and implementing new protective measures. Queen Beatrice, for her part, tried to remain calm, but her nights were filled with nightmares about spinning wheels and ancient curses. Aurora, now an extraordinarily beautiful young woman, was beginning to feel the weight of the restrictions more than ever. Her walks through the inner gardens no longer satisfied her growing curiosity, and the stories told by the servants about the world beyond the castle walls fed her dreams of freedom. One particularly hectic morning, Aurora discovered a secret passage behind an antique tapestry in her chamber. The narrow, dark corridor led to a small abandoned tower, which offered a privileged view of the kingdom. There, hidden from watchful eyes, the princess spent hours observing the life that pulsed beyond the castle walls. It was during one of these secret escapades that Aurora met Philip, a young apprentice gardener who had recently been hired to look after the royal gardens. Unlike the other servants, who always treated her with extreme formality, Philip chatted with her, naturally sharing stories about the villages and ordinary people of the kingdom. "What's it like living out there?" asked Aurora, her eyes shining with curiosity as she watched Philip work in the garden below his secret tower. "It's a simple life, but full of adventures," he replied, describing the festivals in the villages, the dances around the campfires, and the stories told by travelers in the taverns. Their friendship grew discreetly protected by the secrets of the abandoned tower. Philip would bring Aurora small gifts from the outside world, wildflowers that didn't grow in the castle gardens, stories from traveling merchants, and occasionally sweets prepared by his mother in the village. Meanwhile, Maleficent watched everything from her dark kingdom, satisfied with the way things were turning out. Her Raven Diablo brought her daily reports on the castle's activities, and the evil fairy realized that Aurora's growing restlessness could be the key to bringing her curse to fruition. The 12 good fairies also noticed the changes in Aurora. During their visits, they noticed how the young princess was becoming more pensive and distant, her eyes often lost on the horizon. Luce, in particular, sensed that something important was about to happen. We must be even more vigilant, she warned, during a secret meeting with her fairy sisters. Aurora is entering a crucial phase of her life, and Maleficent will surely try to use this to her advantage. Queen Beatrice, noticing the changes in her daughter's behavior, tried to get even closer to Aurora. She began to share stories of her own youth and the challenges of growing up as a princess. Mother, Aurora asked during one of these intimate moments, why didn't you ever tell me about the curse? The question took the queen by surprise. How? How did you know? I hear the whispers of the servants. I see the fear in Papa's eyes, Aurora replied softly. And sometimes in my dreams, I see a woman in green who tells me about an inevitable fate. Aurora's confession triggered a series of heated discussions between the king and queen. Stefan wanted to increase the restrictions even further, while Beatrice argued that it was time to tell her daughter the truth. She has a right to know, insisted the queen. How can we protect her from something she doesn't even know exists? While the adults debated their fate, Aurora continued her secret meetings with Philip. Their friendship was beginning to develop into something deeper, although neither dared to admit it. Sometimes I dream that I'm free like the birds, Aurora confided to Philip one golden afternoon, that I can fly beyond these walls and discover the world for myself. Philip, who had long since realized that his feelings for the princess went beyond simple friendship, replied carefully, perhaps one day you will be able to, but for now, let me be your eyes on the outside world. What neither of them knew was that Maleficent had bewitched Diablo into taking the form of one of the many birds that Aurora fed in her window. Through him, the evil fairy not only watched, but also began to subtly plant ideas of rebellion in the young princess's mind. As Aurora's 15th birthday approached, her dreams of the woman in green became more frequent and vivid. In each dream, Maleficent showed the princess tantalizing visions of freedom and adventure, always guiding her towards a mysterious tower where a spinning wheel awaited. The good fairies, sensing Maleficent's growing influence, redoubled their efforts to protect Aurora, each in their own way, tried to strengthen the princess's spirit against the temptations of darkness. Spring taught her about the beauty of patience through the cultivation of rare flowers, while Melody showed her how music could be a refuge in moments of solitude. But it was the budding love between Aurora and Philip that seemed to be the most effective protection against Maleficent's influence. Every smile, shared every kind word, exchanged every moment of mutual understanding, strengthened Aurora against the shadows that tried to seduce her. And so, while the entire kingdom prepared for the inevitable confrontation with fate, a love story blossomed silently in the shadows of a forgotten tower, like a stubborn rose growing between the stones of an ancient wall. The weeks leading up to Aurora's 15th birthday brought a remarkable change in the castle's atmosphere. Preparations for the big celebration were underway, but there was a palpable tension in the air. King Stefan, consumed by anxiety, could hardly sleep, spending his nights walking the castle corridors and personally checking every guard post. Aurora, for her part, found more and more comfort in her secret meetings with Philip in the abandoned tower. Their conversations were now deeper, filled with meaningful glances and eloquent silences. On one particularly memorable afternoon, Philip brought with him a small harp, a gift from his grandmother, and taught Aurora an ancient love song from the kingdom. My grandmother used to say that this melody has the power to chase away the shadows. He explained gently, guiding Aurora's fingers across the strings of the instrument. The soft sound echoed through the tower, creating a moment of peace. Amid the castle's growing restlessness, Maleficent, watching through Diablo's eyes, realized that she had to act quickly. The growing love between Aurora and Philip threatened to strengthen the princess against her influence. During the night, the evil fairy began to intensify her attacks through Aurora's dreams, mixing tempting visions of freedom with seductive whispers about a mysterious tower where all her questions would be answered. Queen Beatrice, noticing the growing weariness in her daughter's eyes, finally decided to take action. One quiet morning, she took Aurora for a private stroll in the castle's remote gardens. My dear, she began, holding her daughter's hands, it's time you knew the whole truth about your destiny. With tears in her eyes, the queen revealed the full story of Maleficent's curse and the modification made by Luce. Aurora listened in silence, several pieces of the puzzle of her life finally falling into place. So that's why I have these dreams, murmured Aurora, and why I've never been able to leave the castle. The revelation, instead of terrifying Aurora, as her parents had feared, seemed to give her new strength. Knowing her enemy made the battle more real, more tangible. That night, when she met Philip, she shared all her burdens with him. No matter what happens, Philip promised, holding her hands tightly, I'll be by your side to face it. The 12 good fairies, realizing that the crucial moment was approaching, began to take turns guarding the castle. Luce, in particular, began to carefully observe Aurora's dreams, trying to create barriers against Maleficent's influence. As the day of her birthday approached, strange events began to occur in the castle. Unexplained shadows danced across the walls, and mysterious sounds echoed through the night. The guards reported glimpses of a large black raven that seemed to be everywhere at once. Aurora, strengthened by Philip's love and the knowledge of her destiny, began to actively fight the temptations in her dreams. When the woman in green appeared, the princess faced her with the songs Philip had taught her and the lessons in courage she had learned from her fairy godmothers. However, Maleficent had one last trump card. One particularly dark night, she managed to plant a crucial doubt in Aurora's heart. What if Philip's love wasn't true enough to break the curse? The seed of uncertainty began to grow, fed by the young princess's deepest fears. Philip, noticing the change in Aurora's behavior, stepped up his efforts to show his love. He began to bring her small, meaningful gifts, a peacock feather that resembled the colors of her eyes, a bouquet of wildflowers that only grew in the distant mountains, a small notebook in which he wrote poetry dedicated to her. The fairies, watching the romance unfold, shared hopeful glances. The love between the young people seemed genuine and strong, exactly the kind of true love capable of breaking ancient curses. Meanwhile, in the confines of her dark kingdom, Maleficent was preparing her final blow. With her dark magic, she began to create a special spinning wheel, imbued with an irresistible power of attraction. Even if all the spinning wheels in the kingdom had been destroyed, this one would be enough to fulfill the prophecy. The tension in the castle reached its peak when Aurora's birthday was just a week away. King Stefan, in a last, desperate effort to protect his daughter, ordered that she be transferred to an isolated tower in the castle, far from any potential danger. It's just a precaution, my dear, he explained as Aurora gathered her belongings, only until your birthday has passed. The princess accepted the decision with surprising calm, but her heart was heavy. The designated tower was not the one where she met Philip, and she knew she would be completely isolated. Before leaving, she managed to send a secret message to her beloved through one of the birds she used to feed. Don't lose hope, the note read, for my heart will remain with you no matter where I am. The move to the tower marked the beginning of the last phase of this story, where love, fate, and ancient magic would intertwine in a final dance for the future of the young princess. On the eve of Aurora's 15th birthday, the tension in the castle reached its peak. The princess watched the sunset through the window of her secluded tower, her thoughts divided between Philip and her increasingly intense dreams of Maleficent. The soft evening wind carried with it the scent of flowers from the garden, and with it a strange sense of inevitability. During the night, while everyone was asleep, a greenish glow began to emanate from a dark corner of the tower. Aurora, who was restless in her bed, sat up when she noticed the mysterious light. An inexplicable force attracted her, as if invisible strings were pulling her body towards that hypnotic luminosity. On her throne of thorns, Maleficent smiled with satisfaction. Her magic had finally found a breach in the castle's defenses. With a flick of her staff, she intensified the spell, causing a secret passage to reveal itself in the wall of the tower. Aurora, as if in a trance, followed the illuminated path. The guards who were supposed to protect her had been bewitched by Maleficent and fell into a deep sleep. The princess climbed spiral stairs that seemed to have no end, her bare feet barely touching the cold stone steps. Philip, who was secretly standing guard in the gardens near the tower, noticed the strange glow in the upper windows. His heart raced as he recognized Maleficent's dark magic, which Aurora had told him about. Without hesitation, he began to climb the tower using the ancient vines that grew on its walls. In the depths of the castle, the 12 good fairies also sensed the magical disturbance. Luce, who was closest, immediately flew towards the tower, her silver wings cutting through the darkness of the night. The other fairies scattered around the castle, trying to wake the guards and alert the kings. Aurora reached a circular chamber at the top of a tower she didn't know. In the center of the room, illuminated by that eerie greenish light, was an ancient spinning wheel. Her fingers tingled with the desire to touch the gleaming spindle, while her mind fought against the enchantment. Come, dear, whispered Maleficent's voice, materialized from the shadows. Don't fight your destiny. Some stories have to take their course. The princess hesitated. The lessons of courage from her fairy godmothers and Philip's love fighting against the dark magic that clouded her thoughts. You can't force me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Maleficent laughed a cold sound that echoed off the stone walls. I don't need to force you, my dear. The curiosity in your heart will do it for me. Don't you want to know what the spindle chimes sound like? Don't you want to find out if your gardener prince really loves you enough to break the curse? Just then, Philip reached one of the chamber's windows. His heart froze as he saw Aurora slowly approaching the spinning wheel. Aurora, he shouted, his voice cutting through the magic-laden air. The princess blinked, the sound of her beloved voice temporarily breaking the spell. But Maleficent was ready. With a gesture of her staff, she created a magical barrier that prevented Philip from entering the chamber. "Watch, young fool," teased the evil fairy, "as destiny is fulfilled." Luce arrived just then, her silver magic colliding with Maleficent's green barrier. The two spells intertwined in a light show as Aurora continued her slow walk towards the rock. "Aurora, remember who you are," shouted Luce, maintaining her magical attack. "Remember the love in your heart." The princess stopped, her fingers inches from the spindle. For a moment, images flooded her mind. Philip teaching her the song in the abandoned tower, her mother telling stories of courage, the fairies sharing their gentle magic. Maleficent, realizing that she was losing control, intensified her spell. "Touch him," she commanded, her voice charged with power. "Complete your destiny." At that crucial moment, Philip managed to find a gap in the magical barrier. Throwing himself through it, he ran towards Aurora. His fingers almost reached hers, but it was too late. The princess's finger touched the tip of the spindle, and a single drop of blood fell to the stone floor. Aurora staggered, her eyes meeting Philip's one last time before she fell. He caught her before she hit the ground, holding her in his arms as silent tears streamed down her face. Maleficent laughed triumphantly, her body turning into green flames that danced through the chamber. "The curse is complete," she declared, disappearing in a burst of emerald light. The whole castle seemed to sigh. As Aurora closed her eyes, falling into her enchanted sleep, flowers began to sprout from the stones on the floor, covering the chamber with their wild beauty. The 12 good fairies arrived one by one, their faces marked by sadness and determination. "All is not lost," said Luce, approaching Philip, who still held Aurora in his arms. "If your love is true, you can break the curse." Philip gazed into the serene face of his beloved, remembering every moment they had shared in the abandoned tower, every smile, every sweet word. Leaning in gently, he pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss filled with all the love he held in his heart. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Then slowly, a golden light began to emanate from Aurora's chest, spreading throughout her body. Her eyelids fluttered and finally opened, revealing those blue eyes that Philip loved so much. "You've come," she whispered, smiling. The castle erupted in celebration. King Stephen and Queen Beatrice, who had just arrived in the chamber, rushed to embrace their daughter. The fairies danced in the air, their colorful magic creating a light show that rivaled the sunrise. And so true love proved stronger than the most powerful of curses. Aurora and Philip were married in a magnificent ceremony where the 12 good fairies served as godmothers. The kingdom of Aurora entered a new era of peace and prosperity, where the magic of true love continued to protect its inhabitants for many generations. As for Maleficent, it is said that she still wanders the shadows of the kingdom, bitter and lonely, a reminder that hatred and revenge can never triumph over the power of true love. Winter had set in with unprecedented cruelty in that small village on the edge of the forest. The snow covered the roofs of the wooden houses, like a heavy white blanket, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the lament of those struggling to survive. In one of these houses, the most modest of all, lived a family that, like so many others, was facing terribly difficult times. Juon, a 12-year-old boy, with curious eyes and brown hair that was always tousled, shared a small room in the attic with his sister Maria, a 10-year-old girl who, despite her young age, already showed wisdom beyond her years. Their days were filled with little adventures around the house, always together, as if they were each other's shadow. The children's father, a lumberjack with calloused hands and a constantly worried expression, spent his days in the forest trying to make a living from it, which was becoming increasingly scarce. His second wife, a thin woman with a stern look on her face, had joined the family only 2 years ago, after the children's mother died during a particularly cruel winter. Meals, which used to be moments of joy and communion, became silent and tense. The bread, increasingly hard and scarce, was divided into smaller and smaller portions. John and Mary could see the growing despair in the eyes of their father, who could barely look at his children during meals, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. One particularly cold night, when the children should have been asleep, altered voices from downstairs caught their attention. John and Mary, driven by curiosity and fear, quietly descended the attic stairs, taking a seat on the top step where they could hear the conversation without being noticed. "There is no other choice," said the stepmother, her voice a whisper full of determination. "We can't feed 4 mouths. We can barely feed ourselves. If we carry on like this, we'll all starve to death." The father protested weakly, his voice laced with anguish. "They're my children. I can't just. Tomorrow, you'll take them to the deepest part of the forest," she continued, ignoring his protests. "Leave them there. Nature will decide their fate. It's cruel, yes, but it's even crueler to watch them all slowly starve to death." John felt Maria tremble beside him and held her hand tightly. In the darkness of the stairwell, the silent tears of the siblings mingled with the muffled sobs of their father, who finally gave in to the terrible plan. That night, while his sister slept a restless sleep, John stayed awake, his young brain working furiously in search of a solution. The full moon illuminated the room through the small attic window, and it was its glow that gave him an idea. He got up quietly, and picking up a piece of hard bread he had saved from his last meal, began to reduce it to crumbs. The next morning, when their father called them for a walk in the woods, John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. In his pockets, John carried the crumbs that would be his salvation. Maria, who had always been the more observant of the two, memorized every detail of the path, every peculiar tree, every stone that could serve as a reference. The forest swallowed them deeper and deeper. The father, walking ahead, occasionally wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his worn shirt. John discreetly dropped the breadcrumbs, creating a trail that would guide them back home. Maria squeezed her brother's hand tightly, finding courage in each other's presence. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, they reached a small clearing. The father, in a trembling voice, asked the children to wait there while he searched for firewood nearby. "Don't go anywhere," were his last words before disappearing into the trees, leaving his children alone in the cold green immensity of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. John and Mary stood still listening to the sounds of the forest intensifying around them. The wind whispered among the leaves, birds sang somewhere far away, and small animals ran across the ground covered in dry leaves. "He's not coming back, is he?" whispered Maria, her voice small and frightened. John hugged his sister, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "Don't worry," he said. "I've left a trail of crumbs. When it gets dark, we'll be able to follow you back home." But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, a terrible discovery awaited them. Searching for the start of the trail of crumbs, they found only a few bird feathers and no sign of the path they had marked. The birds of the forest, hungry as all get out in that cruel winter, had devoured their only chance of return. Darkness began to approach, bringing with it an even more intense chill and even more threatening sounds. John and Mary, now truly lost in the forest, clung to each other, seeking warmth and comfort. Fear was beginning to settle in their hearts, but along with it, a fierce determination to survive, to find a way to stay together against all the odds the forest could throw at them. What they didn't know was that their journey had only just begun, and that the dangers of the forest would only be the first of many challenges they would have to face. In the growing darkness, something was watching them, something that had long been waiting for visitors like them, something that would make their quest for survival even more desperate than they could have imagined. Night was rapidly advancing over the forest, bringing with it ever-lengthening and threatening shadows. John and Mary, still hugging each other to protect themselves from the biting cold, began to look for a safe place to spend the night. The boy, trying to keep his composure for the sake of his little sister, scoured the surroundings in search of some natural shelter. "There," exclaimed Maria, pointing to a large fallen tree whose exposed roots formed a kind of natural hollow. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the icy wind that was starting to blow harder. The brothers settled into the small space using dry leaves to create an insulating layer between them and the damp ground. Hunger was beginning to set in, painfully reminding them of why they had been abandoned. John searched his pockets, finding just a few crumbs left over from the bread he had used to mark the way. He carefully shared them with Mary, although they were barely enough to fool his stomach. "John," whispered Maria, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think there are wolves in this forest?" Before John could answer, a distant howl cut through the night air, making them both shrink even further into their makeshift shelter. The boy hugged his sister tighter, feeling his own heart racing. "Don't worry," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "They don't usually get close to people." The night seemed endless. The sounds of the forest, once just a backdrop to their little daytime adventures, now seemed amplified and threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every twig snapping under the weight of some nocturnal animal, startled the siblings. Maria eventually fell asleep in her brother's arms, exhausted by the day's walk and the emotional stress. John, however, stayed awake, determined to protect his sister. He watched the dancing shadows cast by the moonlight through the trees, trying to distinguish real threats from tricks played on his increasingly fertile imagination. With the first ray of sunshine, the siblings woke up completely chilled and even hungrier. Their stomachs rumbled painfully, reminding them that they hadn't eaten properly for days. Leaving their night shelter, they started walking in no particular direction, hoping to find some sign of civilization, or at least something edible. Look, exclaimed John, pointing to a bush laden with small red berries. Maria, however, grabbed his arm before he could reach them. Wait, she said firmly. Remember what Mom taught us. Some berries are poisonous. John stepped back, grateful for his sister's caution. His mother had indeed warned them about the dangers of the forest before she died. They continued walking, now more attentive to their surroundings, looking for signs of the fruits and mushrooms that their mother had taught them were safe to eat. The hours dragged by, and the hunger became harder and harder to bear. The sun was already high in the sky when a sweet, irresistible aroma reached them, making their stomachs growl even louder. It was a smell unlike anything they had ever smelled in the forest, sweet, inviting, almost magical. Can you smell it? Asked Maria, her nose moving like that of a small rabbit sniffing the air. John nodded, already moving in the direction of the tantalizing aroma. The siblings began to follow the scent, their tired legs finding new energy in the promise of food. As they advanced, the scent grew stronger, and something began to glow among the trees ahead. Pushing aside some low branches, John and Mary emerged into a small clearing and stood paralyzed at the most extraordinary sight they had ever witnessed. There, as if straight out of a dream, was a house. But it was no ordinary house. It was a building made entirely of sweets. The walls were made of gingerbread, decorated with colored candies and icing. The roof was covered in chocolate tiles, and the windows were made of crystallized sugar that sparkled in the sunlight. A path of different colored stones led to the door, and as they got closer, they realized that they were made of drops and hard candies. This can't be real, muttered Maria, rubbing her eyes as if she expected the vision to disappear. John approached cautiously and touched one of the walls. His finger sank lightly into the soft honey bread, and he brought a small piece to his mouth. The taste was more delicious than anything he had ever tasted. It's real, he exclaimed, already plucking another larger piece from the wall. Maria, it's all real food. The hunger that tormented them overcame any vestige of caution. The brothers began to devour pieces of the house, alternating between the gingerbread on the walls and the colorful candies that decorated them. The taste was so wonderful, so beyond their expectations that, for a moment, they completely forgot their fear and exhaustion. They were so engrossed in their impromptu feast that they didn't notice when the door to the house opened silently. A figure watched them from the threshold, a strange smile forming on its wrinkled face. It was only when a sweet, melodious voice cut through the air that the children realized they were no longer alone. Well, well, said the voice, making John and Mary freeze in place, their mouths still full of sweets. What lovely little visitors I have today. The person at the door was a kind-looking lady dressed in colorful clothes and an immaculate white apron. Her eyes, however, had a strange glint that made John instinctively take a step in front of his sister. Poor things, you must be starving, the lady continued, opening the door wider in an inviting gesture. Why don't you come in? I've got lots more goodies inside, and you look like you could use a nice hot dinner. John and Mary looked at each other, torn between the fear of the unknown and the hunger that had not yet been completely satisfied by the sweets in the house. The lady continued to smile patiently, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for their decision. What the brothers couldn't know was that behind that kind smile and the promise of more treats lurked a danger far greater than anything they had faced so far in the forest. The candy house was just the beginning of an ordeal that would test not only their courage, but also their cunning, and above all, the bond that united them as brothers. The lady stepped forward, and the light coming from inside the house created strange shadows on her wrinkled face. John squeezed Maria's hand, feeling his sister tremble slightly. Hunger, however, spoke louder than fear, and the delicious aroma coming from inside the house was simply irresistible. Come, come, urged the lady, her voice as sweet as the honey that decorated the walls. A nice hot soup will do you a lot of good. You're so skinny. With hesitation, the children followed the old woman into the house. The inside was even more impressive than the outside. Candied sugar furniture gleamed under the light of scented candles, and curtains made of caramel threads waved gently. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, covered with a tablecloth that seemed to be woven from cotton candy. Sit down, said the lady, indicating two stools next to the table. I'm going to prepare something special for you. As she moved around the kitchen, John and Mary observed every detail of the room. Despite its sweet and welcoming appearance, there was something disturbing in the air. On the walls, John noticed strange marks, as if someone had scratched the sweet surface. Maria, for her part, couldn't take her eyes off a large cage in the corner of the room, partially covered by a dark cloth. The lady soon returned with two steaming bowls of soup, the aroma of which made the children's stomachs rumble even more. Eat it all, she said, her eyes shining in a strange way. You need to get your strength back. The children began to eat greedily, but John noticed that his hostess kept her eyes on them, especially on her fingers, as if she were evaluating them. The soup was delicious, but there was a strange taste that he couldn't identify, something that made his tongue tingle slightly. What are your names, dears? Asked the lady, taking a seat at the head of the table. I'm John, and this is my sister Mary, replied the boy, noticing that his voice sounded more slurred than usual. His head was beginning to feel heavy, and the candles seemed to create dancing shapes on the walls. What lovely names, smiled the lady. But her smile now seemed different, more predatory. You can call me Griselda. Maria had already finished her soup, and her eyes were beginning to close against her will. John struggled to stay alert, but his limbs felt heavier and heavier. The last thing he saw before succumbing to sleep was Griselda's smile, turning into something terrible, and her eyes glowing with a green, unearthly light. When John woke up, he found himself inside the large cage he had noticed earlier. His hands and feet were tied with ropes made of licorice, and his head was still spinning from the effects of the potion Griselda had put in his soup. Maria was in a separate cage, still unconscious. Ah, she's finally awake, said Griselda, her voice now completely different from the melodious one that had greeted them. It was harsh and cruel, matching her true appearance, which was now revealed. A witch with long twisted fingers, a pointed nose and eyes that shone with an ancient malice. What are you going to do to us? Asked John, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the fear he felt. Oh, my dear, laughed the witch, the sound resembling fingernails scratching a blackboard. You'll be my dinner, of course, but first I need to fatten you up a bit. You're too thin for a good meal. At that moment, Maria began to awaken, her eyes widening in horror as she realized her situation. The witch approached her cage, appraising her with critical eyes. The girl first, decided Griselda. Younger children are always more tender. John felt his blood run cold. No, he shouted, shaking the bars of his cage. Leave my sister alone. The witch only laughed, a horrible sound that made the sweets on the walls shake. Don't worry, little one. Your shift will come soon. But first, let's start feeding your little sister properly. Thus began a terrible period for the siblings. The witch forced Mary to eat huge quantities of sweets and treats, while John was fed only hard breadcrumbs. Her plan was clear. She wanted to fatten Mary up, first keeping John too weak to try anything. But the witch didn't count on the children's cunning. During the evenings, when Griselda retired to her room upstairs, John and Mary whispered to each other, planning their escape. Maria had noticed that the witch had very poor eyesight and relied mainly on her sense of smell and touch to guide her. John, for his part, carefully observed the witch's routine, memorizing every detail of her habits. Every morning, Griselda would check on Maria's progress by asking her to extend a finger through the bars of the cage. The witch poked it, grumbling about how the girl was still too thin. What she didn't know was that Maria, following John's idea, had started extending a small chicken bone they had found on the floor of the cage, deceiving the witch about her true state. The days turned into weeks, and the witch's patience began to wear thin. Maria remained thin, despite all the food, and John, although weak from lack of food, kept his mind sharp, observing and planning. The children knew they had to act soon, before Griselda realized the trick or decided she had waited long enough. One particularly dark night, while the witch was snoring in her room, John whispered to his sister, "Tomorrow, Maria. Tomorrow we'll try. Remember the plan?" Maria nodded in the darkness, clutching the chicken bone in her hand. "I remember, John, but I'm scared." "I'm scared too," John admitted. "But it's our only chance. We have to outsmart her." The brothers stayed awake for the rest of the night, their hearts beating fast at the prospect of what was to come. The plan was risky, and if they failed, there certainly wouldn't be a second chance. But as John had said, it was their only hope of survival. As the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the crystallized sugar windows, the brothers heard the witch's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. It was time to put their plan into action and find out if their cunning would be enough to overcome the evil that held them prisoner. The sun had barely risen when Griselda descended the stairs, her heavy footsteps echoing through the candy house. She approached Maria's cage first, as she always did, her eyes emitting that greenish evil glow. "Good morning, little one," hummed the witch in her fake voice. "Let's see if you're ready for my feast." Maria, trembling slightly, held out the chicken bone through the bars. The witch felt it with her gnarled fingers, frowning in frustration. "Impossible!" exclaimed Griselda, her voice filled with rage. "How can you still be so thin with all that food?" It was at this point that John put the first part of the plan into practice. "Maybe," he said, his voice weak but determined, "she needs something more substantial than sweets." The witch turned to him, puzzled. "Go on," she ordered, her eyes shining with renewed interest. "Our mother always said that roast meat was the best way to put on weight quickly," John continued, praying that his voice didn't betray his nervousness, especially if it's well seasoned and cooked in the oven. A mischievous smile spread across the witch's wrinkled face. Yes, yes, she murmured, rubbing her hands together. That makes sense. And I happen to have an excellent oven. Griselda moved quickly through the kitchen, lighting the large stone oven that took up an entire wall. The flames soon began to crackle, casting dancing shadows across the candy house. I need to check that it's the right temperature, said the witch more to herself than to the children. It has to be perfect. John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. It was exactly what they had planned. The witch was so engrossed in her preparations that she didn't notice when John started fiddling with the lock of his cage with a piece of wire he had found a few days earlier. Come here, little girl, Griselda ordered, opening Maria's cage. I want you to help me check the oven. Maria hesitated, but knew she needed to keep the witch distracted while John worked on her release. She approached the oven with faltering steps, observing the flames that licked the inside of the stone structure. I can't see properly if it's hot enough, complained the witch, her poor eyes hampering her assessment. Get in there and tell me how the flames are. Maria took a step back, feigning fear. I don't know how to do that, she said, her voice trembling. Griselda snorted with impatience. You fool, just go in and look. Like this. Look. The witch leaned into the oven, demonstrating what she wanted Maria to do. At that very moment, John finally managed to open his cage with an agility that surprised even him. Considering his weakness, he jumped out and ran silently to his sister. The moment the witch was leaning completely over the oven, John and Mary gathered all their strength and pushed her over. Griselda let out a horrifying scream as she fell into the burning oven. Maria quickly closed the heavy iron door while John locked the bolt. The witch's screams and imprecations echoed through the candy house, making the gingerbread walls shake. The children hugged each other, their hearts beating wildly as the sounds diminished until they ceased altogether. We did it, whispered Maria, still hardly believing it. But there was no time for celebration. John was already rummaging through the house looking for supplies to take with him on his escape. In the kitchen, they found a cloth bag, which they filled with bread and dried fruit. Maria discovered a small chest full of gold coins and jewelry, probably stolen from other victims of the witch. Should we take it? She asked hesitantly. John considered for a moment before replying, yes, we can use it to help our family and other needy people in the village. As they prepared to leave, something extraordinary began to happen. The candy house began to melt and crumble, as if the witch's death had broken some enchantment that kept it standing. Chocolate dripped down the walls, and the crystallized sugar on the windows dissolved like snow in the sun. Quick, shouted John, grabbing his sister's hand. We've got to get out of here. The children ran out of the collapsing house, carrying their precious supplies. Behind them, the magical construction had completely melted away, leaving only a giant puddle of melted sweets on the forest floor. The sun was high in the sky now, and for the first time in weeks, John and Mary could feel its rays warming their faces. The forest seemed different, less threatening. It was as if the witch's death had dispelled a dark mist that hung over that part of the forest. Which way should we go? Asked Maria, looking around. John closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the stories his mother used to tell him about how to find your way around the forest. Moss always grows on the north side of the trees, he said, "and our village lies to the south of the deep forest." So the brothers began their journey home, stronger and wiser than when they had been abandoned. The weight of the sack of provisions and the treasure chest was barely noticeable. So great was their relief at being free. As they walked, they talked about what they would tell their father and how they could use the witch's gold to help not only their family, but the whole community that was suffering from hunger. The sun was beginning its descent over the horizon when they spotted a familiar puff of smoke rising above the trees. "It's the chimney of the blacksmith's house," exclaimed Maria, recognizing the pattern of the smoke. The brothers' hearts were filled with renewed hope. They were almost home, but they knew that their adventure had changed their lives forever. They were no longer just two frightened children. In the forest, they were survivors who had faced evil and won through their cunning and brotherly love. "Dad, Father," Maria's joyful cries cut through the air as she and John ran towards the little wooden house they knew so well. The woodcutter, who was sitting on a tree stump in front of the house, with his face buried in his hands, raised his head when he heard the familiar voices of his children. His eyes, red and swollen from crying, widened in disbelief. In an instant, he was on his feet, running towards the children with open arms. The encounter was an explosion of emotions, tears, hugs, and words of joy and regret. "My children, my dear children," the father sobbed, clutching them to his chest, as if he feared they would disappear again. "Forgive me, please forgive me. I should never have—" "It's all right, Dad," John interrupted, his voice soft and understanding. "We know you had no choice." His stepmother, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door. Her normally stern face showed signs of surprise and curiously relief. In the days since abandoning the children, the weight of her decision had begun to eat away at her conscience. You've come back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But how?" Maria and John looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They decided at that moment that some parts of their story would be better kept secret. After all, who would believe a house made of sweets and an evil witch? "We found help in the forest," replied John diplomatically, adjusting the weight of the bag of provisions on his shoulders. "And we've brought something that can help not only our family, but the whole village." Carefully, he opened the sack and showed its contents, first revealing the food they had collected. Then Maria presented the small chest. When she opened it, the glitter of gold and jewels made the adult's eyes widen in amazement. "Mercy," exclaimed the stepmother, putting her hands to her mouth. "Where did all this come from?" "It's a gift," said Maria firmly, "to help people who are starving." In the weeks that followed, a remarkable transformation took place in the small village. The treasure found by the children was used wisely. They bought seeds to plant animals, to raise, and tools to work the land. The father, now freed from the constant worry about immediate survival, was able to devote his time to teaching other families more efficient farming techniques. The stepmother, touched by the generosity of the children she had condemned, changed profoundly. Her heart, previously hardened by bitterness and fear of hunger, began to open. She became a central figure in organizing community efforts, ensuring that no family went without. John and Mary grew up respected in the community, not only for their mysterious good fortune, but above all, for the wisdom they showed despite their young age. At night, when the younger children of the village gathered around the fire, they would tell stories, some true, some imagined, about the dangers and wonders of the deep forest. Sometimes, when they were alone, the brothers would talk about their adventure in the candy house. Although the horror of those days never completely left them, they also remembered how that experience had strengthened the bond between them and taught them valuable lessons about courage, cunning, and the importance of trusting each other. You know, John, Maria said one afternoon, as they watched the sunset from the attic window they still shared. Sometimes I wonder if other lost children found that clearing after the candy house melted. John smiled, taking his sister's hand. If they did, I hope they only found wildflowers and edible mushrooms. The witch is gone, and with her, her evil magic. Time passed, and the story of John and Mary became a legend in the village, whispered from generation to generation. It told of two children who faced adversity with courage and came back not only with gold, but with something much more valuable, the wisdom that true treasure lies in the love between siblings and the strength that comes from facing fears together. The winters were still harsh, but the village was now prepared to face them. The families had learned to work together, share resources, and look after each other. And when the snow covered the roofs and the wind howled through the trees, people gathered in their warm homes, telling stories about two brave children who changed the fate of an entire community. John and Mary grew up keeping the memory of their adventure alive, not as a horror story, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of situations, hope and cunning can light the way back home. And although they never again tasted sweets as extraordinary as those from the witch's house, they discovered that the sweetest taste of all was that of freedom and family love. On particularly dark nights, when lost children wandered through the forest, they said that two mysterious lights appeared to guide them back to safety. Some swore that they were the spirits of John and Mary, eternally vigilant, protecting other children from the fate they themselves had managed to avoid. And so, the story of two siblings who overcame hunger, evil, and despair lived on an eternal testimony that brotherly love and courage can overcome even the most terrible obstacles. Their legacy remained not only in the hearts of the people of the village, but in all the children who, on hearing their story, learned the importance of sticking together and relying on each other in the most difficult times. In a distant kingdom where magic still danced freely among the ancient trees and wishes had the power to change destinies, lived a couple in a small house on the edge of the forest. Anna and Thomas, married for 10 years, shared a dream that seemed more and more distant to have a child. Every night, Anna watched the stars through the window of their modest kitchen, whispering silent prayers to the heavens, while Thomas worked tirelessly in their small garden, hoping that one day they would be able to share their fresh vegetables with a child of their own. The couple's house stood next to a high wall of old stones covered in ivy and moss. On the other side stood the legendary garden of the witch Gothel, a mysterious woman who was rarely seen by the villagers. Stories about her power and cruelty circulated like the wind through the narrow streets, but few could confirm their veracity, as those who dared to approach her lands were never seen again. One spring morning, when the first rays of sunlight were still struggling to break through the mist, Anna discovered that she was pregnant. The news spread through the village like pollen on the wind, bringing joy and celebration. Thomas, ecstatic, immediately began preparing the small room next to theirs, imagining the day they would rock their baby to sleep. It was during the second month of pregnancy that the cravings began. These were no ordinary pregnant cravings. Anna developed an overwhelming obsession with the radishes that grew in Gothel's garden. She could see them from her window, their lush, green leaves swaying seductively in the breeze, their fat, juicy roots occasionally visible when the strongest wind stirred up the loose earth. "They're the most beautiful I've ever seen," whispered Anna, her hands pressed against the glass of the window, eyes fixed on the forbidden garden. "Thomas, I feel like I'm going to go mad if I don't taste them." Thomas tried to grow his own radishes, but nothing he planted seemed to satisfy Anna's desire. She wasted away, day after day, barely touching her food, her eyes always on Gothel's garden. After weeks of watching his wife waste away, Thomas made a decision that would change their lives forever. One moonless night, when the shadows were thickest and the silence deepest, Thomas climbed over the wall. His heart was pounding so loudly that he feared Gothel could hear him from across the garden. With trembling fingers, he plucked a few radishes and ran back to the house. Anna devoured the vegetables as if they were the most precious delicacy of the gods, and for the first time in weeks, she slept with a smile on her face. Encouraged by his wife's success and happiness, Thomas repeated the feat the next night, and the next, and the next. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. Jumping over the wall, Thomas found Gothel waiting for him in the garden. The resurrected witch was tall and imposing, her night-black hair contrasting with her moon-pale skin. Her eyes, green and penetrating, seemed to shine with a light of their own in the darkness. So, his voice was smooth as silk, but sharp as a blade. "It is you who have been stealing my precious radishes." Thomas fell to his knees, trembling. "Please forgive me. My wife is pregnant and has developed an uncontrollable craving for your radishes. She can't eat anything else she's wasting away." A sinister smile appeared on Gothel's lips. "Ah, a life growing up. What an interesting coincidence. I've wanted a child of my own for so long." His eyes flashed with a terrible idea. "Let's make a deal then. Your wife can have all the radishes she wants, but in return, when the child is born, it will be mine." The horror of the proposal struck Thomas like a thunderbolt, but before he could protest, Gothel continued, "It's either that, or I'll report your thievery to the kingdom. You will be executed, and the child will die before it is even born. The choice is yours." With a heavy heart and tears in his eyes, Thomas accepted the deal. He returned home carrying not only the radishes, but also the weight of his decision. In the months that followed, Anna received baskets and baskets of fresh radishes, never suspecting the terrible price they would pay for them. When the baby was born, it was a girl with hair as golden as the sun and eyes as green as emeralds. Anna barely had time to nurse her daughter for the first time before Gothel showed up to collect his debt. The witch named the child Rapunzel and disappeared with her into the night, leaving behind only the echo of the disconsolate sobs of a mother who had just lost her only child. Years passed, and Rapunzel grew up under Gothel's care in a house hidden in the forest. The witch, fearing that someone might try to steal the girl, planned to keep her close at all times. When Rapunzel turned 12, Gothel revealed her final plan, a stone tower that stood alone in the middle of the densest forest, with no doors or stairs, just a single window at the top. It was there that Rapunzel lived, her tears watering the stone floor, while her golden hair grew in an extraordinary way, becoming her only connection to the outside world. Every day, Gothel would visit the tower, bringing food and company, climbing Rapunzel's long hair, as if it were a golden rope, while humming, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, toss your braids." But the years unfolded slowly in the lonely tower where Rapunzel grew up in isolation, her days marked only by regular visits from Gothel. The witch, who insisted on being called Mama, dedicated herself to educating the young girl in the arts. She considered appropriate music, poetry, embroidery, and curiously the preparation of ointments with medicinal herbs. Rapunzel's hair, golden like rays of sunshine, continued to grow in an extraordinary way, reaching over 20 meters in length. Every morning, she spent hours combing it, watching it shine in the sunlight that came through the only window in her prison. During these solitary hours, she sang to herself, her crystalline voice echoing through the forest, attracting birds that became her only friends, apart from Gothel. In her moments of solitude, Rapunzel developed an insatiable curiosity for the world beyond her window. She took advantage of every visit from Gothel to ask questions about life outside, about the people she occasionally saw passing in the distance, about the mysterious lights that floated in the sky on her birthday. The witch, however, always responded with warnings about the dangers of the outside world. "The world is full of cruel people, my flower," Gothel would say, stroking Rapunzel's golden hair. "Here you are safe. Here no one can hurt you or steal your special gift." Rapunzel never fully understood what gift Gothel was referring to, but she did notice something different about her hair. When she sang an ancient melody that the witch had taught her, they gave off a soft, golden glow, and Gothel looked younger and more vigorous after brushing them. It was a mystery that the young girl kept in her heart, along with her dreams of freedom. To fill her days, Rapunzel developed various talents. As well as singing, she learned to paint, using paints that Gothel brought her. The walls of her tower became a living canvas filled with images of the world she imagined existed beyond her window. Verdant forests, crystal clear lakes, bustling cities, and above all, the mysterious floating lights that appeared once a year. One afternoon, while painting another of her visions of the outside world, Rapunzel noticed something different in the forest below. A group of travelers passed near the tower, their laughter and chatter reaching her like music. Hiding behind the curtain, she watched, fascinated, as they interacted with each other, their faces lighting up with genuine smiles, something so different from Gothel's calculated smiles. What would it be like, she thought, to be part of that world? At night, lying in her bed, Rapunzel began to question her situation more intensely. Why did she need to be locked up? Why was Gothel the only person who could visit her, and why did her hair always have to stay so long? Her doubts grew like vines in her heart, but the fear cultivated by years of Gothel's warnings prevented her from taking action. The witch had painted such a terrifying picture of the outside world that Rapunzel felt torn between her desire for freedom and the terror of the unknown. In her 17 years, Rapunzel developed a routine to keep her sane. She woke up at sunrise, fed her little chameleon Pascal, an unexpected gift she had found in her window one day, and managed to hide from Gothel and began her daily chores. She cleaned the tower, combed her long hair, prepared her own breakfast with the supplies Gothel had brought, and devoted herself to her various artistic activities. Between one activity and another, she dreamed. He dreamt of the feel of the grass under his bare feet, of the coolness of a stream on his skin, of the wind blowing freely across his face. But most of all, she dreamed of discovering the meaning of the floating lights that appeared in the sky every year on her birthday. Gothel insisted that they were just stars, but Rapunzel knew that wasn't true. She had studied the stars for years, knew their positions, their movements. The lights were different. They appeared only once a year. They moved differently, and they seemed to call to her as if they were keeping a secret about her very existence. As her 18th birthday approached, Rapunzel began to feel a growing restlessness. Something inside her told her that it was time for a change, that she couldn't spend the rest of her life watching the world through a window. But how could she convince Gothel to let her leave even for a day? The answer to her prayers would come in an unexpected way, brought by a visitor who would change her destiny forever. But for now, Rapunzel continued with her daily routine, singing to the birds, painting her dreams on the walls, and waiting for the moment when her real life would begin. Pascal, her little green confidant, watched the changes in his friend's behavior with attentive eyes. The chameleon seemed to understand that something important was about to happen, something that would transform not only Rapunzel's life, but the entire kingdom that she didn't even know existed. The morning began like so many others in the lonely tower. Rapunzel woke up to the first rays of sunlight and began her daily routine, humming softly as Pascal watched her from the windowsill. However, something in the air seemed different, as if fate itself was about to knock on her door, or rather, her window. The sound of horses' hooves echoed through the forest, something unusual in such an isolated region. Rapunzel, curious, cautiously approached the window, hiding behind the curtain. A young man on a magnificent white horse was galloping through the trees, apparently running away from something. His movements were agile and precise, but his expression showed concern. The rider, who Rapunzel would later discover was called Flynn Rider, seemed to be looking for a hiding place. His pursuers, royal guards on dark horses, were fast approaching. In a moment of desperation, Flynn spotted the lone tower, and without hesitation began to climb it, using the old stones for support. Rapunzel, who had never interacted with anyone other than Gothel, panicked. Her first instinct was to hide, but something inside her, perhaps the same restlessness she had been feeling, made her stay put. When Flynn finally reached the window, he was greeted by a sharp blow from the frying pan that knocked him unconscious. "Pascal, what have I done?" whispered Rapunzel, looking alternately at her chameleon friend and the fainted stranger on the floor. The little reptile turned an alarmed shade of red, indicating his concern. Her heart racing, Rapunzel examined the unconscious visitor. She had never seen a man so closely before, and something about him intrigued her. He didn't look at all like the terrible monsters that Gothel described in his stories about the outside world. On the contrary, He had harmonious features and was dressed elegantly, although his clothes were a little dirty from the run. As she watched him, she noticed something shiny falling out of his bag, a delicate crown set with jewels that sparkled in the sunlight. Rapunzel picked it up, marveling at its beauty, and as she placed it on her own head, she felt a strange familiarity that she couldn't explain. The sound of distant voices brought her back to reality. The guards were still searching the vicinity of the tower. Acting quickly, Rapunzel hid Flynn's unconscious body in her closet after tying it up tightly with her own hair, a precaution that seemed sensible at the time. Rapunzel, let me up my flower. Gothel's voice echoed from outside, making the young woman's heart leap. With frantic movements, she hid the crown in a ceramic vase and ran to the window. During Gothel's visit, Rapunzel could barely concentrate. Her mind was torn between the man hiding in her closet and the possibilities his presence represented. When she finally managed to get rid of Gothel, who left for a 3-day trip in search of rare herbs, Rapunzel turned her attention to her prisoner. Flynn woke up confused and frightened, especially when he realized that he was bound by impossibly long golden hair. His expression of astonishment on seeing Rapunzel for the first time was something she would never forget, a mixture of admiration and incredulity. "Where's the crown?" were his first words, revealing more about his character than he had intended. "It's hidden, where you'll never find it," Rapunzel replied with more confidence than she really felt. Then, mustering all her courage, she made a proposal that would change their lives forever. "I want to make a deal with you, Flynn Rider." The thief raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "How do you know my name?" "I heard the guards shouting. Listen, I want you to take me to see the floating lights that appear in the sky on my birthday. In return, I'll give you back your crown." Flynn tried to argue, to explain that they were the lanterns of the royal festival, not mysterious lights, but Rapunzel was determined. After much negotiation, threats with the frying pan, and a few demonstrations of the magical power of her hair, which she accidentally revealed by healing a cut on Flynn's hand, they reached an agreement. The prospect of finally realizing her dream made Rapunzel's heart beat faster. As she prepared a small bag with the essentials for the journey, she chatted excitedly with Pascal about her first adventure. "Just imagine, Pascal, I'm finally going to find out what those lights are. And who knows?" She hesitated, looking at her reflection in the mirror, the memory of the crown on her head still vivid in her mind. "Maybe I'll find out more about myself." Flynn watched her animation with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. There was something special about that girl, with the magical hair, something that went beyond her beauty or her extraordinary powers. She had an innocence and enthusiasm for life that he had long since lost in his adventures as a thief. The moment Rapunzel finally put her bare feet on the grass for the first time, the world seemed to stop. The sensations were overwhelming: the smell of the damp earth, the soft texture under her feet, the breeze caressing her face. She alternated between giggles of pure joy and moments of deep regret, questioning her decision to leave the safety of her tower. Flynn, observing her reactions, began to feel something change inside him. The mission that had initially been just a means of recovering the stolen crown was beginning to turn into something more meaningful. There was something about the way Rapunzel saw the world with such new and amazed eyes that made him question his own life choices. As they walked away from the tower, neither of them realized they were being watched. Between the shadows of the trees, a pair of eyes followed their every move, and a plan began to form in the depths of a vengeful mind. Rapunzel's adventure was just beginning, and it would be far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The journey through the forest proved to be a life-changing experience for Rapunzel. Each new discovery provoked reactions of pure enchantment, from the sweet taste of wild fruit to the reflection of the sun in the crystal clear waters of a stream. Flynn, for his part, found himself increasingly fascinated by the way his traveling companion saw the world through such pure and amazed eyes. During a rest stop, sitting by a small lake, Rapunzel decided to share more about her life in the tower. You know, Flynn Gothel always told me that the outside world was dangerous and cruel, but so far I've only found beauty and kindness, she commented while absent-mindedly playing with a wildflower. Flynn felt a pang of guilt when he heard those words. After all, he was a thief, precisely the kind of person Gothel had warned Rapunzel about. Yet something was changing inside him. Every genuine smile from Rapunzel, every moment of shared discovery, caused his old values to begin to dissolve. "It's not all that simple, Rapunzel," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "The world has its real dangers, but it also has its magic. I think the key is to learn how to navigate between the two." As they talked, Pascal, the ever-attentive chameleon, noticed suspicious movements among the trees. The little reptile quickly changed to an alert orange hue, drawing Rapunzel's attention. Not far away, the royal guards were still searching for Flynn and the stolen crown. With agility acquired from years of escapes, Flynn guided Rapunzel along an alternative path, their hands naturally intertwined as they ran between the trees. Rapunzel's long golden hair, while making escape difficult, proved useful at various times, serving as a rope to cross ravines or as improvised camouflage. Afternoon was beginning to fall when they reached a small tavern on the edge of the forest, the Naughty Duckling. Flynn hesitated for a moment, knowing the reputation of the place well, but they didn't have many options for shelter. To his surprise, what began as a potentially dangerous situation turned into one of the most memorable experiences of the trip. The tavern goers, despite their rough appearance, were completely captivated by Rapunzel's sincerity and enthusiasm. Before long, muscular thugs were singing about their secret dreams of becoming pianists, dressmakers, and collectors of ceramic unicorns. The young woman discovered that appearances really could be deceiving, and that there was goodness in the most unlikely places. During the evening in the tavern, Flynn watched Rapunzel with a new eye. He saw how she could see the best in people, how her presence brightened up the gloomiest of surroundings. For the first time in a long time, he began to question his own life choices and the path he had taken so far. However, the momentary peace was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of the royal guards. The tavern's customers, now unlikely allies, helped the couple escape through a secret passage at the back of the establishment. As they ran through the dark tunnel, Rapunzel held Flynn's hand tightly, her heart beating fast, not just from the danger, but from the thrill of the adventure. "Flynn," she whispered, as they walked through the damp tunnel. "What's your real name?" The question took him by surprise. After a moment's hesitation, he answered softly, "Eugene. Eugene Fitzherbert." Eugene. Rapunzel repeated the name fondly, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel ashamed of his true identity. As they emerged from the tunnel, they found themselves in a deep canyon with an ancient dam at the bottom. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The beauty of the moment was interrupted by the sound of horses' hooves and altered voices. Guards had found another route. In a moment of tension, they found themselves trapped between the royal guards and a group of bandits who were also chasing Flynn for the stolen crown. It was at this critical moment that Rapunzel demonstrated all her ingenuity, using her magical hair in ways that even she herself didn't know were possible, as a rope, a whip, a safety net. During their frantic escape across the dam, something definitely changed between them. When Flynn chose to save Rapunzel rather than retrieve the crown that had fallen, they both realized that their hearts had found something more valuable than any royal treasure. Drenched and exhausted, but alive, they found refuge in a small clearing near a stream. As they dried their clothes by a makeshift fire, a new intimacy grew between them. Rapunzel shared more about her life in the tower, her moments of solitude, and her dreams of freedom. Eugene, for his part, shared stories of his childhood in the orphanage and how he became Flynn Rider. What neither of them knew was that not far away, Gothel had discovered Rapunzel's escape. The witch, consumed by rage and the fear of losing her, source of eternal youth, was plotting a sinister plan to recover her precious flower. The shadows of the coming night held secrets that would soon change the fate of everyone involved in this story. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Eugene and Rapunzel sat by the fire, their hands occasionally touching their hearts, beating to a new rhythm. Pascal watched everything with his attentive eyes, changing to a rosy hue that reflected the romantic moment unfolding before him. Dawn brought with it the promise of the big day. Finally, Rapunzel would see the floating lights she had dreamed of. Eugene noticed how she could barely contain her excitement as they approached the city. Her green eyes shone with an intensity that rivaled the sun itself as she absorbed every new detail of the urban environment that unfolded before her. The city was celebrating its annual lantern festival in memory of the lost princess. Colorful banners decorated the cobbled streets, musicians played on every corner, and children danced to the sound of joyful melodies. Rapunzel, completely enchanted, dragged Eugene from stall to stall, trying sweets, admiring handicrafts, and taking part in folk dances. During a dance in the main square, Eugene couldn't take his eyes off her. Her golden hair now expertly braided with colorful flowers by a group of local girls shone in the sunlight. Her smile lit up the whole room, and her joy was contagious. It was at that moment that Eugene realized he was hopelessly in love. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the alleyways, Gothel watched her flower with a mixture of anger and determination. The witch had arrived in the city following the clues left by the pair and was now planning her next move. She noticed how Rapunzel looked at Eugene, recognizing the nascent love in his eyes, a love that threatened to destroy everything Gothel had built over the years. As the day progressed, Eugene surprised Rapunzel with a small boat. To get the best view of the lanterns, he explained, helping her aboard. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as they rowed out into the middle of the lake that surrounded the castle. Eugene. Rapunzel whispered her fingers, playing nervously with a lock of hair. What if it's not everything I dreamed? What if it's exactly as I dreamed? What do I do then? He held her hands gently, his eyes meeting hers. Then you find a new dream, he replied with a gentle smile. The moment was interrupted by the first glow in the sky. The first lantern, released from the castle by the king and queen, rose alone in the night. Soon thousands of other lanterns began to float around the city, creating a spectacle of light that reflected off the calm waters of the lake. Rapunzel was amazed, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of the lanterns. Eugene had prepared 2 lanterns for them, and together they released them into the sky, watching them dance among the others. The moment was magical, intimate, perfect. It was then that Eugene made a decision that would change everything. He took the crown out of his bag and presented it to Rapunzel. I don't want it anymore, he said softly. I've found something more valuable. Before Rapunzel could reply, a strange light on the shore of the lake caught her eye. There were 2 lanterns, positioned in a way that she recognized immediately. It was a sign from Gothel, one she had known since she was a child. Fear gripped her heart. Eugene, I need to check something, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I promise I'll be back soon. Eugene agreed to wait for her, not suspecting that this moment would mark a dramatic turning point in their lives. Rapunzel found Gothel waiting in the shadows, but the conversation that followed was not at all what she had expected. He's only interested in the crown, my flower, Gothel declared with false concern. Watch. Rapunzel watched in horror as 2 men appeared on the boat where Eugene was. From his position, it looked as if he was handing over the crown, voluntarily leaving with them. In fact, Eugene was being attacked, but the distance and darkness masked the truth. Heartbroken, Rapunzel allowed Gothel to take her back to the tower, convinced that her dream of love had only been an illusion. What she didn't know was that Eugene, after escaping from the bandits, ran desperately back to the meeting point, only to find the place empty. In the tower, while packing her things, Rapunzel began to notice details in her paintings on the walls. The sun symbol of the kingdom was unconsciously repeated in her drawings. Memories began to surface, the sun mobile over her cradle, the kind faces of the king and queen, the familiar sensation of trying on the crown. The revelation struck her like a thunderbolt. She was the lost princess. At the moment of this discovery, Eugene was climbing the tower, having finally found his way back. But Gothel was prepared. When he entered through the window, he was greeted not by Rapunzel, but by a dagger that seriously wounded him. Eugene, Rapunzel shouted, running towards him, but Gothel held her firmly. Now do you see what the outside world brings? Only pain and suffering, Gothel declared coldly. But we can avoid that. Let me use your hair to heal you, and promise to stay with me forever. Eugene, gathering his last strength, approached Rapunzel. Don't let it happen, he whispered. With a quick, decisive movement, he cut the long, golden hair with a piece of broken glass. The hair turned brown, losing its magical power. Gothel, aging rapidly, without the magic that kept her young, staggered backwards in panic, tripping and falling through the tower window. Rapunzel held Eugene in her arms, tears falling down her face. One last tear, still containing a remnant of magic, fell on the wound miraculously healing it. True love had proved to be the most powerful magic of all. Days later, Rapunzel returned to the castle as the lost princess reunited with her real parents. Amid celebrations and tears of joy, Eugene was forgiven for his past crimes, and together they began a new life, a life of love, adventure, and freedom. And so, the girl who dreamed of floating lights discovered that her true destiny was far greater than she had ever imagined. Not only did she find her place in the world, but she also brought light and joy to everyone around her, proving that sometimes the best dreams are the ones we didn't even know we had.